Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mel Ve, coming to you live on Conscious Consumer Network this Wednesday evening, and it is so good to be with you. It is 7 p.m. GMT. That makes it 8 p.m. here in Central Europe, and thank you to you wherever you may be in the world. Thank you for tuning in. Tonight, we are doing an episode of Dragonology, which is Dragonology Season 3. And for those of you who may not have caught Season 1 and 2, please feel free to go out and check out all 13 episodes of both Season 1 and Season 2, both made up of 13 episodes each. And it will definitely make a lot more sense to you as we go through this information if you have actually gone through the previous 2 seasons. Otherwise, we will try as much as possible to make each episode as all-inclusive for those potential people who may not have seen this before. In episode 4 of season 3, we're going to be talking about origins, more specifically human origins and cultural origins. And then we're going to go focusing on to ancient sites of interest. And of course, the piece de resistance for the evening will be focusing in our attention on the oldest ritual and serpent worship site ever to be found. So quite a treat in store for you tonight, guys. So do stick around. Starting off with the word origin. I love this word, and when we talk about human beginnings or cultural beginnings, this for me is the word that I like to use, because not is it just aptly describing the beginning of us or civilization by using the word origin. Where do we come from? Where do we originate from? Okay? The word origin is actually a very, very special word, which is why I always use it when I want to reference to where something comes from, the origination. The word origin contains 2 very key dragon root words. Of course, first, the most common dragon root word being or, the O and the R, which is obviously done here in purple. And the dark red, we've got jinn. And we're going to be dealing a bit with the jinn tonight. We have dealt with jinn over the past few weeks quite extensively, but we're going to take it a little bit further, a little bit sideways, and a little bit inways, so you can see all the dimensions and all aspects of this material. So the word origin is made up of the or and the jinn. And last week we did speak about the significance of the eye being a representative of the pyramid with the all-seeing eye on top, hence why we call the eye an eye. Much like the letter A and the letter O, the eye is very significant in dragonology. So just remember that often letters have a much deeper allegory than just being a phonetic sound that makes up a word. Often there's a huge amount of mythological history, spellcasting allegory that's all heavily imprinted into these things that we think are just, a couple of scrolls across a page. So when we talk about the origins of humanity, the one thing that always seems to come up is creational mythology. And it really doesn't matter which culture you're approaching with this. Each culture seems to have its version of, particularly cultures that, label the history under mythology or folklore. There seems to be a creational myth associated with almost every culture you come across. And what is very funny is there's also the continued appearance in different cultures across the world of creational gods. And in many cases, these creational gods actually take on the form of dragons or giant serpents, or serpent gods, serpent deities, winged gods. There's a number of labels that have been given to them over the years, but dragons or serpent gods and deities have been credited as being the creators of humanity. And the creational element is consistent throughout cultural mythologies across the world. Now, remember, we have, of course, also spoken about previously how the creational elements, earth, wind, fire, spirit, for example, are also interrelated with the dragon. So, of course, the creational mythologies are also very intricately interrelated with the dragon. And this particular picture over here is typically how the depictions of Earth would have looked according to the Scandinavian sort of Norse mythology. This is a representation of Asgard with a tree of life. And you will always notice, for those flat earthers, this would be a particularly fascinating depiction, because what you notice very readily around the edge of the so-called flat earth over here is that wall of Antarctic ice that they believe, if we live in a flat earth model, that is what would be surrounding us, and it's very, very, very clearly depicted here. But just inside that wall of ice, you've got a serpent consuming its tail like the Ouroboros would, which surrounds what would then be supposedly the habitable parts of Earth. And in the middle of this habitable part, of course, you've got the Tree of Life, which has a link to the underworld. And this is all very interesting because this depiction actually comes up in various other representations in things like Egyptian mythology. So there's a lot of similarities between various mythologies across the world that supposedly were not interconnected with each other, but when you look at the similarities between them, what they give you an idea of is that there must have been a very advanced previous civilization on Earth that somehow influenced these cultures along the way, because there's so many similarities that they all seem to somehow link back to a common origin. Okay, so humanity and the creational myth and the creation of humanity and the creation of the animals and the earth and all that, it's a consistent story. The creational stories turn up everywhere and in absolutely every culture. Now, serpents or dragon symbolism in creational mythology is also very, very prevalent. And not drawing on the obvious ones first, let's dive into some of what perhaps most people do not really recognize that often. Hindu creational myth obviously talks about the earth being balanced on the back of elephants carried by a giant tortoise and then surrounded by what? A serpent. And then you get the Australian original, not Aboriginal, we like to be politically correct, the Australian original races and their mythology, which talks about their creator god called Rainbow Serpent, who created the rivers and the earth and all that kind of thing. And this rainbow serpent is very prevalent in the Dreamtime stories of native Australians. And then, of course, you get the Genesis story, the story of creation and the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden after they were given the apple by a serpent. And I love this particular depiction. This one is actually painted by Michelangelo, and it is entitled The Fall of Man. And you'll notice this particular depiction of the serpent actually shows the serpent as half serpent, half human, much like the typical dragonology depictions of the shape-shifting dragon or serpent, between one form and another. Now, origins and genesis, the words are almost synonym for each other in a way, because when you talk about the origins of something, you can just as easily say, oh, the genesis of something, the beginnings of something, because that is what we have associated the word genesis with, the beginnings, okay? And it's interesting again to notice that there's some very key etymology which turns up, as we say, origins containing the key Jin root word highlighted in purple, and then gen of Genesis, which again, very interesting because we have spoken about this before, how the vowel sounds transliterate out with each other, so the I becomes the E. So this is the same common dragon root that turns up in origin and Genesis. So both origin and Genesis are spelled with a common dragon root word, and this is where this root word comes from. We've spoken plenty about the Jin, and we'll speak a little bit more about the Jin this evening. And there's various ways in which you can spell the Jin. Jin obviously being the Arabic or Islamic classification for dragon, demon, angel. It's various words, you can use various labels, but obviously Jin spelled D-J-I-N-N or just for the J. And as we know, the D and J transliterate out into the G. We spoke about that quite a bit over the last few weeks. And then, of course, you've got gin as in the alcohol gin. And then gen, like the root of Genesis. That gen becomes the root word of genie, as in genie in the bottle, and of course gene as in genealogy. And then you start to go on to where we transliterate the E and the I out for the O. So instead of gen, you've got gone and go. Gone as in here now, gone tomorrow. That, as we've spoken about, the D and J and G, all transliterate out again. So take away the G, put the J back in, and you got John, and of course John with an H, which then goes into the more Germanic version of John, which is Johann, which then goes into the more Dutch version of John, which is Johannes. It can be spelled like that. And if you take away the J, you have Oannes, and we'll be speaking about Oannes tonight, just to show you how we get all the way to Oannes from this particular sequence of following root words. As I said already before, and as we've spoken about in previous dragonologies, the G, the D, and the J all change out with each other, hence why we're able to work this sequence of root words interconnecting with each other. Now the jinn, as we said, are an Arabic or Islamic classification for angels and dragons, and feel free to go Google them. There's some really interesting depictions online, and I wouldn't go for the sort of more computer-generated, deviant art-looking ones. Really go check out the more ones with the ancient Arabic language written on it, because then you know those are the authentic ones. Those are Arabic or Islamic depictions of the jinn, not sort of the westernized version of them. And you can get an idea of how people of that culture viewed and perceived the jinn. And I like this one because in this particular picture, you've got the key hallmarks or trademarks or symbols which always reference the dragon. This little guy over here seems to have fire coming out of his mouth, of course, fire, breathing dragons, horns, and this over here, this creature, whatever it is, has wings on it and a serpent around its neck. So very, very interesting. This one seems to have tongues or something coming out of its mouth, looking a bit like serpents. We've also spoken about the protruding tongue being very much a symbol of the serpent. So there's some really interesting depictions you can find. Here's another one again with the horns. Interestingly enough, this particular jinn seems to be grabbing each of his breasts, probably to show that it's naughty or an erotic notion. And again, here is some more jinn, really beautifully depicted ones with horns. Here we've got the tooth or the fang, which sticks out. We spoke about the fangs last week and how significant the constant repetition of fang symbolism is. You can see a couple of fangs hanging out on this guy over here. But most interestingly are these, which is the green and red wings, very commonly depicted on the Archangel Gabriel. And Gabriel does turn up in Islamic mythology. Remember, it was Gabriel that gave Muhammad most of his instruction. And of course, this particular jinn with yet another serpent around his neck, always the serpent symbolism. Notice, of course, how the D and the J can drop the G, and of course, we can transliterate that into the G as well. And when we do that, we have the extended version of the jinn. This is obviously what the jinn evolved into when we start taking the stuff into fairy tale and folklore. The genie of the lamp. We've all heard about the genie of the lamp. This story comes from 1001 Nights. It's an Arabian story that was translated into French and then into English. And it's been popularized by Walt Disney. But this version of the jinn being the kind of genie that can come out the lamp is very interesting because these genies incorporate one of the very key themes that we always talk about in dragonology, which is the ability to appear and disappear. We talk about theophanies, the ability of gods or dragons or supernatural beings to appear or disappear, and vapor as well. There seems to be like a vapor or spirit, ethereal-like quality to these genies. The word vapor, etymologically cognizant with the word viper, a type of serpent. So you see all the various symbolic allegories that tie in with these various representations that are actually just extended symbolic allegories referencing the dragon. And this is probably the form of genie that most kids who were my age or a bit younger kind of grew up with, being the, Walt Disney. Bless Walt Disney, always weighing in on the dragon symbolism. In fact, I think Walt Disney is probably one of the biggest perhaps when it comes to really sugarcoating or I don't know, sanitizing dragon symbolism into what they consider sort of child-friendly, commercial-friendly, family-friendly images, but ultimately the entire story masks very deep allegories alluding to the dragon. And the story of Aladdin is actually very interesting, and I'll go into talking to them about the etymology of Aladdin, because that is interesting too in relation to this particular line of research. But well, Disney, as we've spoken about this many times, whether it be Marvel cartoons, whether it be Disney, whether it be the Hollywood entertainment mind control machine, they're all in on sanitizing dragon symbolism, making it family friendly, and then putting it in front of us so that we inadvertently worship it, adore it, give our energy to it. Okay? Now, Aladdin, let's talk about the word Aladdin for a second. The word Aladdin obviously contains two very interesting dragon roots. First, El, which is the Arabic El, that would be the Hebrew version, that would be the Il, the Latin version. So that would be Illuminati, electricity, or Elohim, or alphabet would be the AL, and they are the same root, just have different vowel sounds in different language. This would be the Arabic L, this would be the Hebrew L, and this would be the Latin Il. Now, interesting is the word Aladdin, as I say, is spelled with two dragon root words. The second dragon root word being din, which of course is derived from the jinn. As we said, the D, then the J, and the G's transliterate out, and of course you've got a D and a J here, which take that J out, make a double D, and you can see where you get the din from. I chose this particular picture because I thought it was a really interesting, interpretation of the Aladdin story. It's an 1886 theatre poster advertising the production of the pantomime Aladdin. And what is interesting to notice here is, okay, here you've got Aladdin, but this is supposedly the genie. And what do you notice about the genie? Well, the genie's got wings and also legs and costume that look very much like dragon scales, or like the checkered marks of Harlequino or Harlequin, who is actually just another variation of dragon or the devil. So I thought that was rather interesting, which is again why we've included this particular image. Do notice the fairy-like quality of this particular genie, again indicating how the genie is the fairy, is the angel, is the dragon, is the demon. They're all the same creature, just with different labels in different cultures at different times in history. Okay, so, beg your pardon. The word origin, of course, having the word jinn, you get the word gen. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the words that we're going to be picking up on under the gen root word. So of course we've got gene, which of course alludes to genetic, genealogy, and genome. And then what's interesting, if you think about how we originate from genetics. I mean, without genes, you couldn't have a human being, and you can generate an entire human being just by splicing genes together. You know, it's what we call genetic modification. In fact, we've got an acronym for that, genetically modified organisms. Much food, much soy and corn these days are known as genetically modified organisms. Genes that have of different varieties of different things that have been spliced together to create a desired product. So that would be the origin of that species of whatever it is they're splicing. So it would be the origin of that particular species of corn, because they created it by splicing genes together. It is the origin of that species. It comes from the genes. Now, generate, also when you think about your origins, you think about, okay, we start with nothing, we have to generate something. Generate really comes back again to ties into the concept of origins, much like Genesis does. And then you've got generation, where you talk about, one generation in a family, and then the elder generation or the younger generation. And if you go back generation after generation after generation, you'll come to the origins of humanity. So again, it alludes to the sequence of words and thought processes. And of course, gender. You need a gender, a male and a female, to get together to create a child. It is their genes that will then create that child through the process of chiasmata. And gender, again, ties into this genealogy and Genesis theme. And then, of course, genuine, if you understand the whole linking allegory to the words pure and genuine, this ties into the whole concept of dragon bloodlines. And they have to be the genuine dragon bloodline to marry into a genuine bloodline family. Again, we talk about the purity of bloodline. So in this context, genuine and pure would be synonyms of each other. And then, of course, genius. The word genius, of course, if you're a good scholar, you're often thought of as being a genius, talking about being very intelligent, being literate, being enlightened. And, of course, we'll come on to that theme as well with this particular group of words. But for now, I want to talk about the genetic root. So we've spoken about that here. Genetic, okay, genes, genealogy, genome, okay. This, for me, is the greatest evidence of creation. And I'm not talking about the creational myth. I'm talking about genuine creation, the creation of humanity, being the creation of us through genetic manipulation. And I do believe there is truth to the creational mythology, as humanity in our present form was created as a result of genetic manipulation by dragons, serpent gods or deities. And this is the reason why you have the dragon root word gen in genetics, okay? Because they manipulated our DNA to create the races that we have now. And we're certainly not the first race that's been on this planet. When I say race, not the first particular species of humanoid being that's been here. The evidence of that is pretty clear, and I'll get into that a bit more. As I say, evidence of other humanoids clearly exists, other types of human races, other human species. Just have a look at some of these really elongated skulls that have been found. And it's not just one. There's enough here to indicate there was probably a tribe, a whole civilization, maybe a whole race of beings that looked like this, that actually looked like this, that had long skulls. Okay, and you can actually see in some of them they've got like a little lump there where there seems to be a slight bump forward. Here again, a little bump forward there, and here again, a little bump forward. As you can see, they're depicted here. You might imagine how these would look if you saw them in day-to-day life. But even some Egyptian pharaohs have been depicted with very large heads in their sculptures, having elongated skulls. So as far as I'm concerned, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that there were other humanoid races that have existed prior to ours. We're not the only species of human to have ever existed. We most certainly did not evolve from monkeys. There were plenty of other human species long before this particular species was here. And, the bone evidence is being found all over the show to prove that. And, of course, more proof that we are not the only species of humanoid that has ever existed is the fact that we've been finding all over the show just skeletons of giants. And the Bibles even talk about it. In Genesis it says there were giants on the earth in those days. And you can see here that comparatively this guy is just barely the size of the head of one of these skeletons. Look at that. Compare the size of these guys. Absolutely amazing to what we know of human beings today. And the interesting thing is it goes the other way around. It's not just that we've had very big people in the past. We've also have existed very, very, very small people. In fact, there's an entire race of Greenland pygmies that were kind of destroyed in and around the time of the Crusades. No history about them is ever known, apart from a few French words written about them in the odd soldier's diary. But very, very tiny people that they absolutely annihilated in Greenland. And, of course, this is a picture of sort of African-looking pygmies. Look, very short tribe of people. This is the size of the average European. These pygmies are about between 4.5 to 5 feet tall. The average European person is about 5.5 to 6.5 feet tall, just depending. For instance, 2 meters tall, making him 6'6". But There are definitely races of much smaller people. There have been races of much bigger people. There's been races of people with different shaped heads to ours. Oh, there's been talk of giants found that had double rows of teeth. No, we don't have double rows of teeth, but there's another species of humanoid bigger than us with double rows of teeth. So the evidence is there that there are many different human races, different species of humanoid being, bipedal humanoid being that look the way we do, that have the capacity for speech and thought in the way that we do, the opposable thumbs to be able to build and create and write and sculpt and make artworks in quite the way we do. Many different types of species who can do that. I do want to talk a little bit about the junk DNA. I found this lovely artwork and I thought this was very appropriate about our junk DNA, which basically it's a portion of our DNA that just seems to have been unused. And it is for me the biggest indication or the most clear evidence that there has been some genetic manipulation to humanity's DNA at some point in the past, because we are the only species on the planet that have such a large proportion of our DNA which is unused. In fact, chickens use more DNA than we do, just as an example, a larger percentage and more chromosomes. And human beings are using less, are running on less DNA than a chicken. So imagine if all of our DNA was switched on, what we would be capable of. But the simple fact is that a vast amount of supposed junk DNA is actually switched off. It's DNA that doesn't have any function in the body whatsoever, no coding purposes, and the only reason that would possibly be there, because evolution doesn't evolve where it just creates huge parts of you that aren't useful. In the process of evolution, those parts of DNA wouldn't even be there. They would have been made redundant if we had genuinely evolved over a period of time, but we didn't. Human beings did not evolve over a period of time. We were created. The human creational story is not a myth, it is a reality. And one can see that by the vast amount of different types of humans that have been on this planet. And the current species have a huge portion of their genetic material which is switched off. Up to 90% of our genetic material is considered junk DNA. It's not junk. It's got a purpose. It just doesn't function because it's been switched off through the process of genetic modification. And for what reason? I mean, we were created a certain way by certain beings out there. And as I said, the Hollywood machine is just brilliant at hiding truth behind multi-layered allegories. And for those of you wanting a little bit of homework and who have not seen the film Jupiter Ascending, please do yourself a favor and go watch it. It's from the creators of The Matrix, and we all know how accurate the Matrix films are. Much is hidden here in jest. But what is interesting to notice is that they talk about humanity being a product. We are absolutely a product. Evidence suggests that we were created by an advanced species as a resource for them. We are absolutely a human resource. This Jupiter Ascending talks about it perfectly, how they harvest planets to get human life. And these units contain this elixir which gives you eternal youth. And if you actually care to pause on the scene where you see what's on the lid of these elixirs, is actually a dragon. There's a dragon symbol on there, which I thought was incredibly, incredibly telling that we are product, we are resource for dragon gods and dragon beings, and we always have been. Like I said, go see Jupiter Ascending. There's a lot in this film, and yeah, very, very interesting. Lots of allegory, lots of truth to it as well. As I say, being from the creators of The Matrix, you know that it's such a satire. It's absolutely telling you much more truth than it is a science fiction fantasy story. Okay, so quick question. What does Aladdin's lamp, Thor's hammer, Cinderella's glass slipper, the Holy Grail, and Arthur Pendragon's sword pulled from a stone all have in common? Well, let me take you through this because we've covered this off a bit, but just in case you didn't understand what we're talking about here, we're talking about symbolic talisman, okay? Symbolic talisman. And why are all these objects symbolic talisman, or what are they referencing? Okay. The symbol of the lamp, okay? In the story of the Aladdin and the lamp, the genie comes out the lamp. So the symbol of the lamp. A lamp is a multi-layered symbolic allegory referencing the dragon. And there's so many ways in which you can take this. Being a light giver or a light bringer ties into Lucifer. Lucifer coming from the word luxsphere, meaning light bringer. It illuminates, just like the word Illuminati. We're talking about the IL, which we've spoken about before, and the AL and the EL all being the same root from different languages. And then, of course, from light, we talk about being literate, okay? This is where the concept of genius comes in. Someone is able to read and write. And we always talk about how the dragons gave us our symbols, our language, our art, our sculpture, archaeology, made us literate, made us aware of how to associate meanings with symbols and how to use those symbols to create a language, or how to then be able to interpret that language through a form of reading, and then how to cast spells by putting certain symbols together and creating these bigger words and thoughts, which then create labels, which create certain ways in which people treat things. And then we've got whole concept of energetic association, spell casting coming in there. So as we can see, the symbol of the lamp is a multi-layered allegory that goes very, very deep if you start digging through the whole trail of dragonology symbols. And then, of course, we spoke about what the lamp has in common with Thor's hammer and with Arthur and the sword, okay? Now, again, these are symbolic talisman. The hammer and the sword are, like the lamp, symbolic talisman. What they are symbolic of, they're symbolic props which represent the dragon bloodline. Now, try to remember why these particular three are very important. Remember, only those who were worthy would be able to pull the sword from the stone. Only he who is worthy, who is Thor, is able to wield the hammer. And again, he's one of these gods that had wings on the side of his head, much like Mercury, much like Hermes, much like Medusa. Again, the wings on the side of the head being a symbol of the dragon bloodline. And of course, Arthur, being Arthur Pendragon, was his surname. So it tells you Arthur was of the dragon bloodline, and he pulled a sword from the stone. The sword, obviously, only he could pull it from the stone because he was worthy. And it's the whole concept of being worthy, again, being of the dragon bloodline. And these talisman are representative of the dragon bloodline, or the fact that these people are of the dragon bloodline, therefore worthy to rule. The next one, of course, which we've spoken about in great detail in previous dragonologies, is the concept of glass, and more specifically the glass slipper. Cinderella was worthy of marrying the prince because her foot fitted into the glass slipper. Again, very good indication of the back theming which comes in here about how absolutely strict the royals are in terms of making sure that dragon bloodlines intermarry with dragon bloodlines. And of course, the Holy Grail, the Cup of the Covenant, that of course is a very, very common symbol of the dragon bloodline, and turns up in many interesting stories. First off, the story of Jesus and the Final Supper. Then again, of course, in the story of Arthur Pendragon. So what it is referencing again is, it's just a symbolic talisman representing the dragon bloodline. And what is interesting to notice though is that the cup of the covenant is often depicted with a serpent in it, particularly when it's thought to be the poison cup of St. John the Evangelist. And I do want to talk about this because we spoke about the word John earlier. The word John obviously coming from this root, Jin, which DJ, and you just got the J, then it goes to the G, and then you transliterate the I out to the E goes transliterate out into the O, and then the G transliterates out into the J, and then you got the word John. That's where John comes from, okay? So the cup of John, normally depicted with the serpent in it, very interesting. And here's more pictures of John the Evangelist there's so many. If you go Google it, classical artworks, Google John the Evangelist classical artworks, and you'll see how many different famous grandmaster artists made pictures of John the Evangelist and depicted him with the cup and the serpent, which is absolutely amazing. And like we were talking about last week when we look at words that have very key, interesting roots in them, the word evangelist just happens to have the full angel root word contained within it. No coincidence at all. All right, let's deal with Owanis. So the word Owanis, as we've already explained, let's take it from John. Okay, so we've explained how we get the word John from jinn, the Arabic classification from dragon. So John obviously can go into Johnny or Gianni. Gianni is the Italian or Latin way of saying John because they don't use a J in the Italian language. They use G's. And then, of course, you've got from Johnny, you can go Joe to Jose, Jose, or Joseph, Josephine. Then Johann, that's the sort of Germanic version of, or Dutch version of John, Johann. And then Joanna, the feminized version. And from there you can get Anna or Anne, as you see the E transliterates out. And of course, Johannes, from which we get Owanis, right? Owanis. Now, Owanis is an interesting word, and it comes directly out of this, if you do the etymological deconstruction, you can see exactly where the root comes out of. And if you Google Owanis, this is a very interesting picture, normally depicted as having a half fish, half human body, and sometimes with a fish head on top of his, wearing like a fish hat, which is where I would also like to say that Owanis is sometimes referenced as Dagon. And Dagon is often, the fish hat worn by Dagon is often compared with the hat worn by the Pope, known as a mitre. And commonly said there is something fishy in Western religion because the Pope wears a fish hat or a mitre, which is said to be shaped like the head of a fish. So this is Owanis with the fish head and the fish scales in a painting or an artwork of how he would have been described coming up on the Chaldeans as they were at the time, and then they became the Babylonians. But this is Baros's account of Owanis. And here's another carving of woodcut of what Owanis supposedly looked like. Barossus says, a man, or rather a monster, half man and half fish, coming from the sea, appeared near Babylon. He had two heads, one, which was the highest, resembled that of a man, and the other that of a fish. He had the feet of a man and the tail of a fish, and his speech and voice resembled that of a man. A representation of him is still preserved. This monster dwelt by day with men, but took no food. He gave them knowledge of letters, art, and sciences. He taught them to build towers and temples, and to establish laws. He instructed them in the principles of geometry, taught them to sow and gather fruits of the earth. In short, whatever could contribute to polish and civilize their manners. At sunset, he retired to the sea, in which he passed the night. There likewise appears others of the same species. Okay, and this is from Barossus, from Ancient Fragments, saying obviously he wasn't the only one of this type of being that came from the sea that looked sort of half fish, half human, half dragon, half human. But what's interesting to notice is Barossus' account of, okay, so imagine you've got these very primitive people, more probably just people who move through the land, basic gatherers of nuts and fruits and vegetables, stuff like that. And along comes this being out of the ocean and teaches them how to use letters, art, sciences, teaches them to build temples, establish laws, instructs them in mathematics, teaches them to farm. From what I understand from Chinese legends, these dragon gods taught humanity to hunt and to fish. We were supposedly vegetarian before that. We never cooked our food. Cooking is something that came in with ritual, food preparation. We were raw completely raw vegetarians most of the time, eating fruit and vegetables and stuff off the trees, nuts and berries, gatherers. I wouldn't even say hunters, we were gatherers. Nomadic tribes that moved together and lived off the land. Very, very well, very peacefully, but obviously having to adapt to where we could get produce and whatever parts of the land were rich. Things like agriculture was given to us by the dragon gods. Things like hunting, organization of how to manage food and stuff, societies in general. We didn't have anything like what we had now. We're very, very primitive. We didn't even have our languages. Possibly, I'd say, apart from maybe telepathic communication, the way we used to communicate is most likely in grunts and gestures. We had nothing like the complicated articulative system of language that we have now, containing of grammatical structures, vowels, consonants, languages of, specific to different regions, colloquialisms, slang, and everything else in between. We had nothing like that. We had simple, basic communications because we didn't have any complicated concepts. It was basically survive, thrive, love, have family, and that's about it. And simple grunts and gestures was all that was probably required, even for the expression of emotion, which to express emotion, you don't even need to use words most of the time. It is really just a visual or visceral thing as opposed to an oral expression, although I can cry pretty loudly myself at times. But the bottom line is that this particular depiction of Oannes being depicted like a fish, it's not unique to this particular story, because this half man, half fish depiction comes up in so many different cultures. In fact, the Vedic cultures where you've got Vishnu, and Vishnu comes back in what we call avatars, which is many different other forms. That could be just another way of saying that he was shape-shifting. But the Vishnu also came back in the avatar known as Matsaya, which is actually a fish. Here we go, you can see Vishnu, half human, half fish, much like the depictions you've got of Oannes, because they effectively are referencing the same thing, which is dragon gods, which could symbolically be depicted as fish because of the scales. And of course, Queen Melusine, commonly depicted with the lower half of a fish to look like a mermaid. In some tales, she's actually depicted with two tails, being the twin-tailed siren as opposed to a mermaid. But this particular depiction of Melusine as well also has a holding the cup or the grail with the serpent in it. Very interesting to note that. Notice this is a winged mermaid as well. She's got the fish's tail with the wings on. So very interesting indeed. And of course, there's plenty of fish-tailed Greek gods as well. Just need to look in Greek mythology. You find plenty of that sort. You've got Phorcys. Phorcys, of course, has the O-R dragon root word, and also the Orc dragon root word, very common. Orcus is a common dragon depiction as well. And he looks a bit more crab-like, but he is a sea deity, carrying this interesting little two-handled box or handbag, which I will come on to talk about in another Dragonology series, but this is a very interesting symbolic symbol. But over here you've got Triton as well, and of course Triton being depicted with a fish's tail as well, Triton being a sea god. So you can see there's many of these gods that get depicted with the sort of fish lower half, such as Oannes. And Oannes is very significant. In fact, if you go study the works of Manly Palmer Hall, an amazing man, he goes into depth in his studies of Atlantis. He talks about Oannes and where Oannes actually came from, and that Oannes was actually a priest of Atlantis, a wise man from Atlantis, much like the god Thoth, who was the founder of the Egyptian culture. Now, Thoth was also a priest from Atlantis. So what you've got is Oannes and Thoth, probably two dudes or dragon beings or high-ranking priests who worshipped the golden serpent on Atlantis. When Atlantis went under the ocean or was submerged in the Great Deluge, these guys got onto boats and went off to different corners of the world to establish cultures there. Obviously, after the deluge, everybody was kind of wiped out. Humanity was thrown back into sort of Stone Age, where we had absolutely none of the trappings of civilization that we'd previously had, except for the few that survived. And there is actually a very well-known story of a select few people who were chosen to survive a flood. Just think about Noah's Ark. And of course, Noah is very well known to be of the dragon bloodline. You only have to watch the Russell Crowe version of Noah's Ark to see Russell Crowe wrapping his arm in snakeskin, indicating he was of the dragon serpentine bloodline. Now, Thoth, much like Oannes, came from Atlantis. He was a priest of Atlantis, came from an already advanced existing culture with so much knowledge, and brought all of that knowledge with him to Egypt, where he established the Egyptian culture. Thoth was the Egyptian god of knowledge, thought, intelligence, magic, and wisdom. Also gave the Egyptians their alphabet, writing, record keeping, reading, scribes, arts, sciences. In fact, the scribes were a holy, holy set. They were as high as the priests, and very, very few people were allowed to be scribes. And it was probably one of the most sacred roles, because as a scribe, you were directly answerable to Thoth. What's interesting to notice is that Thoth is also called Jehuti, and Jehuti has the DJ, the common dragon root DJ, and the DJ in Egyptian hieroglyphics would be represented as the resting cobra, or cobra at rest, which is the J or the G sound. Anyway, what's interesting to notice is if you say the word Thoth, it's actually etymologically cognizant with the word the, which is another word for God. We talk about theology, or the pantheon, pantheon being the home of the gods, theology being the study of religion or spiritual matters. All right, now we're going to go on to talk a little bit about culture, because we're talking a bit about human origins and sort of where we come from. That, you know, after Atlantis went down, we had a couple of these priests who probably half dragon gods themselves, who then established cultures in other parts of the world. And as Thoth did in Egypt, as Oannes did in Babylon, and these cultures weren't people's natural state. Had these people just been left to their own ways along the banks of whatever coast they were found, and they were never interfered with by the dragons, our natural state is one of tribes, not massive civilizations the way we have now. Tribes where we move around nomadically, perhaps temporary settlements depending on what the resources of the area have to offer at certain times of year. But most certainly the concept of centralized temples where people from far distances would come as to a meeting point, either for ritual or worship, that came with the concept of civilization, with teaching people to read and write and understand symbols and to venerate them, teaching people ritualistic practices such as hunting, fishing, preparing of food, the cooking of food, the sacrificing of animals. Sacrificial ritual is inextricably linked with dragons and with the development of culture. So let's go into this a little bit, talking about culture. And we have absolutely been cultured like bacteria in a petri dish by the dragons. We are dragon cultured. Dragons are credited with giving us our writing, arts, crafts, architecture, farming, hunting, fishing, cooking, law, government, structure, religion. All of that you could attribute to being civilized comes from the dragons. And in fact, temple building is attributed to the dragons. You only have to look at how many temples all over the world. This whole phase of temple building, so much effort and energy has to go into creating these things. Possibly many lives lost during the process of some of these amazing and ancient structures. And you know, these serpents and dragons are found all over these ancient temples and ancient sites where ritual and worship took place. And dragons are represented in many styles and forms, depending on where they're found. And this is a typical Mesoamerican temple, the temple of the feathered serpent, which has, as you can see, serpents on there, which is these long elongated bits behind them, and their heads come out and they have like little plumage around their heads, plumed serpents or feathered serpents. Very, very interesting indeed. And you find these temples with serpents all around them, all over the show. In fact, this is an amazing little place. This is the Wat San Pran Temple Complex in China. And it's an entire building which contains the temples within this building, and then it's got temples on top of the building as well. And the entire thing is wrapped in a dragon. I mean, just absolutely magnificent. And yeah, of course, there's some other examples of temples which have dragons wrapped around them. And what you do find is dragons are commonly wrapped around the columns. And of course, we've spoken plenty about the word column and column symbolism in previous dragonologies. Of course, you're welcome to go look that up in my book, Dragonology Book 1 Spellbreaker. Learn exactly why you always find every culture, every religion, all rooms, you'll find columns. Absolutely obsessed with columns. And there's a reason for it. Okay, now we're going to be focusing on some of the fun stuff. This is where we've been heading towards. Okay, and it's the ancient sites of the world. What I've got here is a listing of various ancient sites, and I'm going to go through them, but various ancient sites from the oldest to, I wouldn't say the most recent, but just from the oldest and then going down in sort of date order to the ones that obviously come up at the younger end. But starting off with the Tsodilo Hills, which is where we're going to end up with this presentation. The Tsodilo Hills is a 70,000-year-old ritual worship site, which seems to be a serpent worship site, and we're going to talk a bit about that in a bit more. But I want to pay attention to the dates. I want you to notice the dates on these things because it's very, very important that you do so. What we've got in terms of what has been found in the date range that's closest to this is 30,000 years for 30,000 years gives you 60,000 years. You don't even have 60,000 years old. You've got 70,000 years. So more than half, I beg your pardon, less than half of how old Tsodilo Hills would be. You've got the Bosnian pyramids. Okay. And then Gunung Padang, which the oldest layers have been dated to 23,000 years old. The Bimini Road between 12,000 and 19,000 years old. The pyramids of Giza match the Orion's belt at 12,500 years before present, and it's much as the same for Angkor Wat, matches the constellation Draco at 12,500 years before present. The Sphinx of Giza is more than 12,000 years old as well. Easter Island Moai statues, more than 10,000 years old. Göbekli Tepe, between 9,500 years before present, and it was abandoned around 9,000 years ago. Then, of course, the Yonaguni Monument, 8,000 years ago, and Gargantua, 5,700 odd years old. I'm going to go into a little bit more about these. Most importantly, what I want you to notice is that the oldest site found, the next closest to it, isn't even half as old, okay? Just to give you some context as to how old the oldest site that has been found to date really is. Okay, that's a biggie. So we're going to go through some of this. Let's have a look. First off, the Moai on Easter Island. Okay, the Moai of Easter Island. Very interesting. I'm sure most people will be familiar with the statues of the Moai on Easter Island. They kind of all line up. These are called ahus. These platforms that they stand up are called ahus. And the platforms are actually, some of them aren't even 800 years old. They've been rebuilt by the locals, but the Moai are much older and they've been put up onto these platforms. In fact, when you look at how the Moai is situated around the island, you'll see that these Moai were probably scattered rather randomly at different points all around. I don't imagine they were placed randomly. I imagine they were placed with very specific purposes by the people that placed them, but placed all over the show, not actually on platforms like this. And you can see as some that didn't quite make it to a standing sort of position, laying in the ground. Here's another vantage point of these Moai. And if you actually go diving off the coast of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island as it's known, proper name is Rapa Nui, you'll find that they actually have moai in the ocean, because there used to be, the water levels used to be a lot lower, and there were actually, you probably find quite a few moai are in the water because they had been placed at parts on land that is now covered up. And over here you can see where they've been carving them from the stone. Some of them they started carving a moai here from this rock. So you can see it was actually carved from the indigenous rock on the island. Massive, massive structures. These things are huge. And we'll give you an example of just how big they are. Okay, this is moai that's been excavated. Typically what we see is the head and shoulders, okay, of most of these things. But if we actually look at the pictures of some of the ones that have been excavated, they're over 30 feet tall. Right? These are big structures. And the amount of time it takes for that kind of sediment deposit, you're talking thousands of years, okay, at least 6,000 to 7,000 years old. But I'd probably, at a conservative estimate, say about 10,000 years to get that level of sediment deposited to the point where these guys are covered up. Of course, another theory I have is that they could have been submerged during a great flood, and this particular peak of Easter Island was the only part that remained when the waters subsided. Of course, huge amounts of sediment got deposited all around these moai, which is why they're so covered up. Then, of course, I could probably go with the argument that, I would still have to say that they're possibly 10,000 year old, and I'd say probably much older, because they've probably been there pre-flood. And the floods, again, are said to have happened about 12,900 years before present. So again, yes, it definitely said these are older than 10,000. You can see them all up on the hill. There's said to be 1,000 of these things all over the island, between 800 to 1,000 of them. I'm not exactly sure of the figure, but there's so many of them that you can imagine that it's not only just on this island you would have found them. They're definitely in the ocean. You've probably got some that are under the ground. I think you might have one up here in the background too. But once they've kind of been, that's amazing when you see just the head like that, and there's probably a whole body underneath there, a whole entire body that is underneath this. It's amazing, all of that, and very intricately carved as well, with the hands coming in front of the body. Notice over here, you've got hands and arms carved onto these giant pillars, which most of us have only seen the heads of. Yeah, let's look at Gargantua, which is in Malta. There are so many of these really ancient pyramid complexes in Malta, and I would just like to say that I really do believe that Malta was a very prominent city within what was Atlantis. In fact, you just look at the word Alta. It looks a bit like that could have been Atlantis. Alta. If you put the T in front of the L, you've got Atla. Okay, so Malta for me definitely has a very strong link to Atlantis. I think it was one of the key cities of Atlantis, and was connected to the mainland, wasn't an island prior to the deluge. But yeah, there's some very interesting anomalies about Malta. I myself have been there and noticed them when I was there. What you will find in Malta, which is most interesting, is a number of these very ancient monolithic temples with these really huge stone pieces, which are, again, tons and tons worth of stone pieces and slabs which have been used to create these ancient temples. And this one happens to be called Gargantua, just as an indication of how big these slabs of rock are that make up the entrance of these temples. They call it Gargantua, which again indicates the size. And this is said to be about 5,700 years old, or it was built or abandoned 5,700 years before present. Again, here you get more of an indication as to some of these big monoliths that they've used to create the entranceways to these magnificently old ruins. And I want to talk about the word Gargantua because we spoke about giants earlier, giants being one of the races that we're finding the remains of all over the show. The word Gargantua comes from the same group of words relating to dragons. which is interesting because from Gargantua you can actually see where you get giant. You've got G and if you put the I here, you take the I, you put it over here, you've got giant. All right, Gargantua there. But then the word Gargantua actually is a reference to the word gargantuan. And the English word gargantuan references anything of immense size and proportion. What's also interesting to notice is from the same roots as gargantuan, you get the word gargoyle and gorgon, which also come from the same root. And of course, as we know, the gorgons are a reference to the dragons. Let's have a look at the gorgons, the Greek gorgons. Medusa, of course, being a gorgon, she's commonly depicted with wings on the side of her head, and serpents around her head. This is the apex of the Gorgon temple. And what's interesting to notice is you can see serpents intertwined around the waist, but also you may notice serpentipedes, winged feet, got wings coming off the feet over here. So very interesting that here, I beg your pardon, another depiction of a gorgon. This is on a crater, a piece of pottery. This particular gorgon depicted with wings, much like an angel or a fairy or a dragon or a demon. So they're all actually the same creature, just under different names. And of course, gorgon has the common dragon root word or in it, and the G-O-N, as in dragon, root word. And gargoyle, of course, stems from gorgon. Gorgon gives rise to a number of other root words, gargle, gargoyle, and gutter, which all come from the gargantuan, giant gorgon root, I beg your pardon. This giant, gargantuan, gargoyle, gorgon root is where you get all of this from. Of course, the gargoyles are really, they're gutters, and they're gutters which take water away from buildings so that they don't erode the buildings as the water comes out these spouts. So when it rains, it directs the water away from the buildings to stop erosion. And what they sometimes make them look like is they tend to make them look like demonic or dragons or hideous effigies of some kind of sort of, I don't know, they're not, gorgons to me have never been settling looking. They've actually kind of always been rather evil looking, which is why I've always been quite amazed at them on churches. Well, not really that amazed, but yeah, these are the gorgons of Notre Dame, very, very famous, of course. And gorgons, again, and gargoyles are, in fact, representations of dragons. Of course, you can see that by the fangs over here. Of course, we spoke about the Yonaguni earlier on being one of the major sites of interest in the ancient world. Again, sunken under the water, and the site is said to be around 8,000 years old. And it's just, again, a massive, immense temple that is very clearly man-made. Nature doesn't make right angles and flat structures like this. And you can see the scale of these temples compared to the people diving on them. It really does look like these things were made by giants. These could have been steps for giants. They certainly weren't steps appropriate for our tiny legs. And here's some more of this underwater city of Yonaguni. Very interesting. You can see, you know, causeway cut through the middle here. That's not a natural feature at the bottom of the ocean. Of course, these two bulls on either side of a stair, they're certainly not natural features at all. What's interesting to notice is you've got something rather Egyptian looking here, which is the bull, which looks like the bull of Hathor with the sun disk in between. Interesting, because you start finding that this kind of look was what the ancient civilizations looked like, the one that was existing all over the world before the cataclysms that took many of us back to the Dark Ages, and then we had to start all over again. But what we had before was something resembling the remnants of the old world can be seen in what is now ancient Egypt. They brought the most obvious remnants of the ancient world over, and their influence, the Egyptian culture of the ancient world, is what remained of the Atlantean culture. Very much the symbols, the architecture, even the way in which they stylized their gods with sun disks and between crescent horns. As I said, much like the Egyptian god Hathor. And this is, of course, below the ocean in Japan. And Göbekli Tepe, one of my favorite megalithic sites in Turkey, interesting places. Why it's interesting is because it was covered in 9,000 years ago, which meant that this place is very well preserved and it's been very easy to date some of the organic material. And some of the organic material has been dated to be as old as 5,000, beg your pardon, 11,500 years old, some of it even 12,000 years old. So this is a 12,000-year-old ancient temple complex with massive, massive stone, T-block shaped stones with just the most incredibly intricately carved details on it. And you know, what's always interesting to notice when you look at these ancient temples is you never at a loss to find serpents. They're always covered in serpents, and Göbekli Tepe, being one of the oldest temples and most well-preserved ancient temples ever found, of course, has no shortage of serpent depictions on its columns and big blocks and building pieces, but not just serpents, some very beautifully carved out animals of many different kinds. But this is actually rewriting history, because most people didn't even think that this sort of thing was going on until 6,000 years ago. That is temple building, reading, writing, organized civilizations like this. And what we're looking at is that we're constantly having to push back how far back we thought civilized man actually existed. And this is where you come into conflict with mainstream historians who have jobs paid by the academia, is that they obviously don't want to rock the boat too much, and they tend to completely disparage any research which takes the date any further back than, say, 6,000 years before present. But the simple fact is that there is clear-cut evidence, especially when you start doing the carbon dating on the organic material in these sites, that they are much older and that civilized man has existed for a long time, possibly many civilizations before ours. It's never a case of that it's just been a steady movement from being, you know, cavemen to being the culture that we are now. We've had many peaks of culture and, of course, many destructions of culture. You just have to look at the huge amount of cities that are under the water that are being turned up in ruins to see how many cultures of the past there were that have just disappeared or been taken up by natural disasters, destroyed by war, whatever the case may be. Another interesting temple, we spoke about this one as well before in Dragonology Season 3, is the Temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which is a phenomenal temple. The latest layers, of course, dating back to about 800 years ago, but the ground layout of Angkor Wat actually is a star map and corresponds with the constellation of Draco as it would have appeared in the sky 12,500 years ago. Now, this is also very, very interesting because this date, 12,500 years ago, okay, is the same date that the pyramids of Giza align with Orion's belt. So this 12,500 years ago, this date, very well done to Graham Hancock for doing this research, because I think it's astonishing that the star maps line up in different parts of the world at exactly the same period in history. As I say, the three stars of Orion's belt line up with the pyramids of Giza absolutely perfectly in the sky 12,500 years ago. And you got the same thing going on, the Draco constellation lining up exactly with Angkor Wat on the ground, okay, perfectly aligned with Angkor Wat on the ground at 12,500 years ago. And that, for me, it's very clear that they were imitating the constellation Orion. These are obviously the key marking points of the major temples of Angkor Wat, which perfectly line up with the Draco constellation. It's unmistakable that this layout of temples was meant to imitate the Draco constellation in the sky, and it was a time capsule because it marked the time in history in which that particular layout was made on the ground. That was 12,500 years ago. The same period of time as the Great Pyramids of Egypt must have been marked out on the ground, because they were marked out to align with the Orion's belt, the three stars of Orion's belt. And of course, your mainstream Egyptologists, you know, give you absolute rebuke when you come at them with this, because they don't acknowledge that the pyramids go back that far. There's a huge amount of controversy about it. In fact, you just have to look at the Sphinx and some of the water erosion that exists on the Sphinx to know that that whole area is pretty damn old, because it must have existed at a time when there was a tropical rainforest where there was heavy precipitation. And because nowadays it's in the middle of the desert, it's completely dry. So it must have been the time when climate was completely different, and that was many thousands of years ago. All right, looking at the Bimini Road, this is a very interesting set of underwater megaliths which have been found off the coast of Florida, and they're dated to be between 12,000 and 19,000 years old. And they're just scattered like these big rocks. And people say, oh, no, those are just natural seabed rocks, etc. They're not natural seabed rocks. In fact, when you look, there's very clear, distinctive lines, and nature doesn't form like that. Okay, very clear, distinctive lines. Here's more of these rocks underneath, and these big megalithic rocks are actually the top of a wall. There are several layers of these rock going underneath what you see here. This is obviously largely covered with sand, but if you had to clear all the sand away, what you're going to find are these massive walls which have several layers of these giant megalithic rocks stacked on top of each other. And this is what we were probably looking at, was some kind of seaport which has now been covered over by the ocean as the sea levels have risen. Potentially a harbour, as has been suggested in some of these drawings, because the way that the rocks actually are scattered comes in a sort of a curve. I'll draw us back to this drawing again over here. You can clearly see there's some lines over there and definite curvature going on here, indicating some kind of wall. So you're possibly looking at a wall like that, where the curvature is. And this is supposed to possibly be some kind of harbour port where the boats came in, and these rocks are built into the ocean to give berths for boats. Not actually sure. It could have been a massive temple complex that's under the water at this stage. It's not very easy to tell what this was, except that these stones were absolutely massive. Again, tying in with these megalithic builders all over the world. This is a sunken off the coast of Florida. Okay, going on to Gunung Padang, which is in West Java, Indonesia. Now, this is an artist's impression of what this particular temple complex, pyramid complex, would have looked like in its heyday. They've continued, obviously, over the years to put layer upon layer upon layer on top of this temple complex, and the latest layers sort of date back to about 4,000 years old. But if you draw down to the core layers, you're looking at 23,000 years before present is when this temple complex was laid out and they started building it. And as I say, it's absolutely amazing site. This is what it looks like today if you're looking at it from a distance at the actual temple hill itself. You do notice it's got several layers here of temple, and this is the very top layer, which is what we're going to be looking at next. This area over here is what most people think is the actual temple complex, but it's not just this area, it's the whole thing underneath that most people don't actually realize is also not just a mountain, that's part of a man-made pyramid, okay? So here's the entire temple complex. Again, you see the agricultural terraces. And this is the top portion that we spoke about over here, this top portion over here. This is what a rough sketch of what it looks like today. The terraces of megaliths is amazing, black and naturally formed megalith stones, which are just kind of scattered all over the top, the very top of this pyramid on various terrace levels. And that's a kind of rough sketch of it, and I'll show you what the images look like. It's just mind-blowing. Okay, to say this is just the very top layer of a pyramid, and these are the remains of possibly what would have been some kind of temple structure at the top of this pyramid, which of course is now all gone to ruins. But even what you see here, these black stones, they were only placed at a much later date. We're probably talking about in the last 5,000 to 6,000, 7,000 years, because the entire temple complex is 23,000 years old at its deepest layers. That is what they've been able to deduce. Here's some more pictures of pyramids, being the Bosnian pyramid. And this is, of course, the oldest pyramid to have been found. It's also the biggest pyramid to be found. It's bigger than the biggest pyramid in Giza, which is very interesting. I just want to give you guys an idea of what it would look like if all the greenery was kind of cleared away. This is what it looks like today, the pyramid in Bosnia, Pyramid of the Sun, with the forests and everything that have grown up over the last 30,000 years. And of course, this is what it would look like if forests and stuff were cleared away. And people for many years are going, oh no, it's a hoax, you know, it's not a pyramid, it's a naturally occurring hill, until they started excavating it and finding these amazing cement and slabs of panels that had been laid, clearly not by nature. So this was clearly an artificial man-made structure that was bigger than the pyramids of Giza, at least 6 to 7 times older from according to official figures. And yeah, just we've had Sam Osmanagic on Conscious Consumer Network discussing the Bosnian pyramids in great detail. And there's so many amazing anomalies to do with this pyramid. So seriously, guys, go do a little bit of research on the Bosnian pyramids. Very interesting site. One I'd certainly love to visit myself one day. And this one checks in at 30,000 years old. As I said, this is only not even half as old as the oldest ritual worship site ever found, which is in Rhino Cave in Sodilo Hills in Botswana, Southern Africa. This particular site is 70,000 years old. It is a 70,000-year-old ritual worship site. It is absolutely phenomenal to have come across something like this. I mean, the average person who didn't know anything about this might walk in there, take one look at it and walk out, oh, what a lovely cluster of rocks and whatever else. But there is so much going on here that I just get excited even talking about it. First off, this is a naturally occurring rock feature which has been carved to look like a stone serpent. This is an eye that's been carved in, and here is, it's not known if this is a naturally occurring feature or if this has actually been carved in over time, but this would be representative of a mouth, okay? And carved into the side of the serpent is hundreds of undulations which have been made over thousands of years. In fact, the remains of some of these undulation carvings were found in the excavations at layers that were 60 to 70,000 years old. So they've been carving these little undulations into the serpent, whoever has been coming here, for thousands of years. And the reason they've been putting these undulations into the serpent is to make it look like scales or serpent skin. And it's very interesting because this particular cave, Rhino Cave, is found in Sodilo Hills, which is in Botswana in southern Africa. I just want to see if I've got a map here quickly so we can show you where it is, okay? Sodilo Hills is in the northwestern corner of Botswana, and Botswana is largely covered by the Kalahari Desert. Now, what you've got is the Okavango, which is probably the closest water source to this, which of course goes into the Okavango Delta. And this is an amazing area if you're into nature and wildlife to go on a safari. I'd been there as a kid, had little knowledge of the Sodilo Hills or the significance at the time. But basically, the Sodilo Hills is a UNESCO World Heritage Site with over 4,500 examples of rock art of native Sankoy people. Now, the Sodilo Hills, as I said, is located in northwestern Botswana and is surrounded by Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. And in fact, these hills are so prominent because they are the only hills for over 100 kilometers in any direction. And it's located in the middle of a desert. So you can imagine there's just flatness all around you. And then in the distance, all you can see are these hills. And when you go there, apparently it's logical because no matter where you are in surrounding areas, you can see these hills because everything is so flat. So it would be a natural drawing point, gathering point, or meeting point of sorts for the many people in the hundreds of kilometers all around, the many tribal districts. So as we say, they are hills which are located in the middle of the Kalahari Desert, the only hills for a very long way around, hundreds of kilometers around in any direction, noticeable from anywhere in the skyline nearby. And here's what was found during the excavation. I just want to go back to this picture of a Rhino cave, because Sheila Coulson, the lady who is the Professor of Archeology, Associate Professor of Archeology at the University of Oslo, she excavated a pit over here under the belly of the Serpent. And what they found was rather astonishing. Middle Stone Age points which were found at Rhino Cave. And Sheila gave a very interesting explanation of this. Actually, her thesis was on these on points. And these aren't made for spears, and it doesn't look like they were made to be used and reused and reused. What these points indicated is evidence of ritual activity. And the way it was described is the material, you can see it's a vast variety of different materials. They're not all made from the same slab of stone. There's lots of different stone here. And some of the stone material has been brought from hundreds of kilometers away. So what's happened is you've had people bringing stone from hundreds of kilometers away, which they then fashioned into points, okay, in the cave, because the flakes of this process were found, okay, and then they were left there. So they were either used and discarded, or discarded, just made, so there's some very extensive energy going in, and then they were discarded, like sacrifice, ritually, like what we call a votive offering. Bought there and left there, made there, deposited there, a votive deposit, a votive offering, never to be retrieved. And that is what a votive offering is. It's a sacrifice in a way. This is representative of your sacrificial ritual. And I did pose a question to Sheila as to whether or not some of these points could have been used, for example, for sacrifice, because why carve points unless you're going to be using it to stab into something or to cut something? I mean, when I, for example, carve something else, a flower, why points? For me, it's obvious that these were implements that were carved for some kind of ritual and then just abandoned or disposed of there, left there, carved for one use and then never used again and left there. Some of these Stone Age points were actually, these Middle Stone Age points were actually burnt at a very low heat and destroyed. Some of them were deliberately smashed. It's almost like they were made and then destroyed on site. And this is very much evident of some kind of ritualized behavior and ritualized activity. And the level at which, when they dug down, it was about a meter down that they found it, was, she reckons, a conservative estimate of 70,000 years ago is the level at which these Stone Age points were started to be found. So it could actually be a case that it's much, much older, possibly even tens of thousands of years older. The 70,000-year-old was just a conservative estimate. So what you've got is, in this cave where you've got a carved serpent, we've had excavation pits sunk under the belly of the serpent where they turned up these Stone Age points. And as I said, they could easily have been used for some kind of sacrificial ritual. For example, cutting the throat, cutting the jugular, getting the, just stabbing, and then discarded, used once and discarded. Unfortunately, there were no bone remains found in the cave, but Sheila did say because it's a desert, human remains do not survive, not even bone. Animals eat everything there. And of course, because it's so arid and hot, it just doesn't last. Decompose would attract animals because of smell from far, etc. So any remains that were there, unless it's a few thousand years old, she says that there's absolutely no chance of finding anything, I doubt it, even past a few hundred years old because of the conditions of the area. But very interesting that these particular points were found. And what this indicates is that there must have been some kind of communication or even a basic trade network, because there would have to be planning going into the point to coming there. Okay, and it shows that this is going on over several years, many hundreds of years of the different layers where the points were found. So it wasn't just a one-off activity. This was going on at a known place for whatever activity was going on in the cave. It had been going on for thousands of years. It was most likely some kind of serpent worship cave where ritual sacrifices were made, and we can find the implements of the sacrifice in the cave. And it's just an absolutely phenomenal find, and I don't think people actually recognize just how interesting this particular find is and what it really means. Here are some of the exotic stone fragments that were found as well in this dig. These are cast-offs or chips that came off the stone points that were being carved. And here is the cave, as I say, by day, with some of the light coming through. And the only light that gets into the cave falls directly onto the serpent, which is interesting. And this is the serpent lit up at night. They took smokeless candles in there. And what they recognized was that why these little undulations were in there was it made the serpent skin seem like it was moving. And it's very interesting to note, because this whole using light to bring life to a stone carved object is very common in ancient temples. In fact, the Quetzalcoatl temple in Mesoamerica, South America, which has various depictions of serpents on it, of the feathered serpent. It actually, on certain days of the year, when the light strikes the various depictions of the serpents, they look like they're crawling down the stairs because of the way the sun comes in. And this very much has the same sort of feel, that they're using light to give sort of animation or life to this stone serpent, which is in a cave. So again, we see the same themes coming through as we see in other serpent worship temples. We've got clear evidence of ritualized behavior, and clear evidence of potential sacrifice because of the way those points have been carved. But as you say, no bone remains, no animal remains or anything have been found as yet in here. But it's obvious after 70,000 or maybe 100,000 years old, it's doubtful that you would find anything in these conditions. But what's also interesting to notice is that Sheila made a very good point of stating that this ground level was probably a meter lower than it is now. This is dust and sediment over like tens of thousands of years that has come in. This stone serpent would have been like possibly as high as our head, where now it's at ground level for us, and it's about a meter or so high, meter and a half high. In times gone by, this stone serpent actually would have appeared to be somewhat suspended from a ceiling in a way, be coming in and be kind of hanging. The ground level is much lower, and you would be looking up to it. And therefore, it would be a logical assumption to assume that underneath it, there would be some kind of ritual sacrifices that go on directly underneath the serpent itself. So I would love myself personally to go and do a few more excavations, not just here, but sort of around it and get deeper down into these areas here to see what you find. But that's not my place to be doing that. And I think there's more to be found here. A couple more excavation pits need to go in to, I think, conclusively decide what the actual function of this temple was. And as Sheila Coulson said in her interview, it's incredibly difficult to find. It's like possibly, like the inner sanctum of a temple where only the initiated priests would know the way to the place, and not a lot of people would be able to get in there at one time, which meant that it was probably quite an exclusive place, but only a few people went, the very few who knew how to get there or where this was in fact, because clearly this was a very sacred place if they are bringing rocks to fashion into implements which they then dispose of. And it looks very much like some kind of symbolic votive offering which has gone on there, and that the points are very much representative of a votive offering or a votive deposit, an irretrievable object. And then, of course, the concept of the sacrifice. They leave these things behind, objects of great value, that a lot of effort has to have gone into it for it to have been a sacrifice. And this is what you find in ancient Greece and ancient times. You find people fashioning these amazing sculptures, bronze sculptures, and then just depositing it at the temples of whichever god they're worshipping and leaving it there. So a huge amount of effort goes into making these things, and they leave it there. Same as a huge amount of effort goes into working and finding the funding to then go buy a little bit of gold that you then take to a Buddhist temple to give Buddha a gold leaf offering. A ritual is not a ritual without a sacrifice. And a sacrifice is not a sacrifice unless it's costly. It's got to really have some effort or sacrificial element behind. You're giving something up, you know, be it a life, be it an object, be it something that means something to you, or a lot of efforts had to go in to something that isn't associated with just basic survival. For example, clothes making, house making, food, etc. It's almost a superfluous act in a way. This definitely, as far as I'm concerned, is evidence, the oldest evidence found of ritual behavior and serpent worship. And Sheila Coulson's conservative estimate regarding the site, as you said, at least 70,000 years before present time. So this is a very significant find. As I've already said, the next oldest site isn't even half as old as this, and that's the Bosnian pyramids. So it's a very, very interesting line of inquiry and research. And as far as I'm concerned, this is definitely evidence of some kind of ancient lost civilization. Evidence of a past culture or peoples who engaged in trade, ritual, and perhaps even serpent worship. These people or cultures may have been completely different to the native Khoisan Bushmen commonly seen there today, who claim they only moved into the area at a later time. They weren't the original inhabitants of the area. They weren't the creators of the Serpent Cave. The wise men or priests of Atlantis worshipped the golden serpent, as we spoke about. And when Atlantis sank, many of these priests went to other parts of the world. Such ones included Oannes, who founded the Babylonian religion and culture, and then Thoth founded the Egyptian religion and culture. And we're looking at a culture that existed so long ago that we don't actually have any reference point for this. 70,000 years ago, we have no reference point. We're looking at a culture that probably existed that was part of an international global culture of serpent worshipping, because Ophiolatry was the oldest religion. And what we see now in terms of religion is what Ophiolatry has evolved into in its various forms. So it's interesting to see that the one throwback from the oldest parts of our past, being serpent worship and cult ritualism, is still very much prevalent in our societies today. So on that note, please do stick around tonight, because we'll be airing the interview with Professor Sheila Coulson at 9 p.m. GMT here on Conscious Consumer Network. So do check that out under the title of Dragonology Extra. And that would be it from me tonight. Please make sure you catch all the archives which are available at ccn.media. All the shows are archived there once they have broadcast live via the live stream. And if you've missed anything in the previous two seasons, please check out Dragonology Season 1 and Season 2 on the dragonology.info website that are all archived on there. And feel free to help yourselves to a copy of the Dragonology Book 1 Spellbreaker. And if you want a discount, just use the discount code Dragonology S3 and you get a €5 discount. Dragonology S3 standing for Season 3. And that gives you the book for €20 instead of 25. Everything is listed on our broadcast guide, guys, so please do go check it out there. We update it weekly, and we have some great new broadcasters and presenters joining us with some amazing information over the course of 2017. So please do support the 2017 Network Support Fund. Conscious Consumer Network is a free and independent media organization supported by public funding, and we do this out of the love of humanity and because we genuinely believe in the betterment of society. Feel free to check out Conscious Consumer Network's website at consciousconsumernetwork.tv, where you'll find everything you need to, the broadcast guide, the link to the live feed, as well as the link to the donate page. And that's it for tonight. We'd like to thank you for supporting free and independent media. My name's been Mel Ve. It has been a pleasure, and I shall see you again. If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire, the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.